In a quiet suburban town, where the hum of daily life seemed predictable, a storm was brewing in the halls of Maplewood High. Emily Dawson, a bright and ambitious 16-year-old, was no stranger to standing out, but when an act of humiliation by someone meant to protect her shatters her confidence, her world turns upside down. What begins as a personal battle for dignity quickly grows into a larger fight for justice. Emily's courage sparks a movement that forces her school, her community, and even herself to confront deep-seated issues of bias and abuse of power. Along the way, she discovers the strength of her voice, the power of resilience, and the unexpected kindness of those who rally behind her. But the road to change is never easy. As Emily faces legal battles, public scrutiny, and moments of doubt, she must decide how far she is willing to go, not just to fight for herself, but to pave the way for others like her. What happens when one voice challenges the status quo? Can a single act of courage ignite lasting change? Emily Dawson woke up to the sound of her younger brother banging on her bedroom door. "Emily, you're going to be late." Ryan's voice cut through the groggy haze of sleep. Emily groaned, rubbing her eyes as sunlight spilled through her blinds, painting the room with soft golden hues. Her room was small but cozy, a space filled with mismatched furniture and scattered books. A half-finished model of a coral reef sat on her desk, a testament to her dream of becoming a marine biologist. "All right, I'm up," she called back, her voice hoarse with sleep. Emily's family lived in a modest duplex in Maplewood, a suburb filled with tree-lined streets and quiet corners. Their home wasn't extravagant, but it carried the warmth of love and resilience. Her father, James, was a civil rights attorney who worked long hours, and her mother had passed away when Emily was 10. Since then, she had taken on responsibilities beyond her years, helping care for Ryan and supporting her father. As Emily got ready for school, she stared at herself in the mirror. Her dark brown curls framed her face, her wide eyes reflecting both determination and uncertainty. She loved her hair, a symbol of her identity and heritage, but she knew it also made her stand out in a school where conformity was the norm. At Maplewood High, the hallways buzzed with energy as students shuffled between classes. Emily walked through the crowd, her backpack slung over one shoulder, a quiet confidence in her stride. She had grown used to the stares, the whispers, and even the occasional comments about her hair. It stung, but she had learned to ignore it. Until today, Miss Dawson, the sharp voice of Officer Brad Turner, stopped her in her tracks. She turned, her stomach tightening as the school resource officer approached. He was tall and broad, his presence intimidating. "Yes," Emily replied, her voice steady but cautious. Turner's gaze swept over her, settling on her hair. "Do you think this is appropriate?" he asked, his tone cold. Emily blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me?" "Your hair," Turner continued, his voice carrying over the noise of the hallway. "It's distracting and unprofessional. We've had complaints." A hush fell over the students nearby, their attention drawn to the confrontation. Emily's cheeks burned with a mix of anger and humiliation. "My hair doesn't break any rules," she said, her voice firm. Turner's expression hardened. "It's not about rules. It's about setting an example." Principal Grace Nolan appeared at that moment, her hesitant steps betraying her unease. Turner gestured toward her. "Back me up here, Principal Nolan. This has been an issue for a while." Nolan fidgeted with the papers in her hand, avoiding Emily's gaze. "Perhaps we should discuss this in my office," she suggested weakly. But Turner shook his head. "No need. I'll handle it." Before Emily could react, Turner reached into his belt and pulled out a pair of scissors. Gasps rippled through the crowd as he grabbed her arm, leading her to a nearby chair. "We'll fix this now," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stop!" Emily shouted, struggling against his grip. "You can't do this." But he didn't stop. The sharp sound of scissors cutting through hair filled the hallway, each snip a blow to Emily's pride and dignity. Strands of her curls fell to the floor, a silent testament to the powerlessness she felt in that moment. When it was over, Emily sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Turner stood back, a smug expression on his face. "Maybe now you'll learn some respect," he said. The hallway was silent, the air thick with tension. Students stared, their phones capturing every moment. Some looked horrified, others uncertain. Emily stood, her legs shaky, but her resolve unbroken. Without a word, she pushed past the crowd, her head held high despite the tears that blurred her vision. At home, Emily locked herself in her room, the weight of the day crashing down on her. She stared at the remnants of her hair in the mirror, her reflection a painful reminder of what she had lost. Her father knocked gently on the door. "Emily, can I come in?" "Yeah," she said quietly, wiping her eyes. James entered, his face a mix of concern and anger. "What happened?" Emily recounted the incident, her voice breaking as she described the humiliation she had endured. James listened intently, his jaw tightening with each word. When she finished, he knelt in front of her, his hands resting on her shoulders. "Emily, listen to me," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "What that man did was wrong. He had no right to touch you, let alone humiliate you like that. We're going to fight this." "But what's the point?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. "It won't change anything." James shook his head. "It will. And even if it doesn't, you deserve justice. No one should get away with treating you this way." His words sparked something in Emily, a flicker of hope amidst the darkness. The next day, James began building a case, reaching out to his contacts and gathering evidence. Emily, though hesitant, agreed to share her story, realizing that her fight wasn't just for herself, but for others who might face similar injustices. Word of the incident spread quickly, first through the school and then the community. The video of Turner cutting Emily's hair went viral, sparking outrage and support. Messages poured in from strangers who shared similar experiences, their words a reminder that Emily wasn't alone. One evening, as Emily scrolled through her phone, she came across a message from a classmate she barely knew. "Hey Emily, I just wanted to say you're really brave. What happened to you was awful, but you standing up for yourself is inspiring. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." The message brought tears to Emily's eyes, not of sadness, but of gratitude. Amidst the pain, there were glimmers of kindness, moments that reminded her she was not fighting alone. As the days passed, Emily began to find strength in the support around her. Her friends rallied behind her, her community voiced their outrage, and her father fought tirelessly to hold Turner accountable. Through it all, Emily discovered a resilience she didn't know she had. Though the road ahead was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure: this was only the beginning, and she was ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, the house was unusually quiet. Emily sat at the kitchen table, her untouched cereal turning soggy as she stared out the window. The weight of the previous day clung to her like a heavy fog. Ryan, her younger brother, wandered into the kitchen, his face somber. He hesitated before speaking. He said softly, "I saw the video. I'm sorry that happened to you." Emily's throat tightened. She managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Ree." Ryan sat down across from her, his small hands clutching his juice glass. "Dad's really mad," he added after a moment. "He was on the phone all night." Emily nodded. She had heard her father's low, urgent voice filtering through the walls of their small duplex. It had been steady, commanding a sound she'd grown to associate with his courtroom presence. James entered the room, dressed sharply as always. His eyes, though kind, carried a determined edge. He poured himself a cup of coffee before sitting beside Emily. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked. Emily shrugged, still humiliated, angry. "Son." James nodded thoughtfully. "You have every right to feel that way. What happened to you was an abuse of power, and it's my job to make sure it doesn't happen again." Emily looked up at him, her voice trembling. "Dad, are you sure this is worth it? People like Turner, they always seem to get away with it." James leaned forward, his gaze steady. "Emily, this isn't just about you. It's about standing up to people like him, so no one else has to go through what you did. Change doesn't happen overnight, but it starts somewhere. It starts with us." Emily swallowed hard, her father's conviction stirring something inside her. That afternoon, James filed a formal complaint with the school district and reached out to the state Civil Rights Commission. He also contacted a local legal aid group to help amplify their case. At school, Emily returned to an atmosphere buzzing with tension. Whispers followed her down the hall, and classmates who had never spoken to her before offered shy smiles or pats on the shoulder. "You okay?" Sarah Brooks asked as they sat together at lunch. Sarah had been Emily's best friend since 5th grade. She was fiercely loyal, with a knack for breaking tension with her sharp wit. "I don't know," Emily admitted, pushing her food around her tray. "It feels weird. Everyone's acting like they care. But where were they yesterday?" Sarah frowned. People are scared to speak up when they see injustice. But now that it's out in the open, they're realizing they should have done something. "It's not fair to you, but it's how people are." Emily nodded, though the explanation didn't erase the sting of feeling abandoned in her moment of need. By the time she got home, the house was filled with a low hum of activity. James was on the phone, pacing the living room with a notepad in hand. Emily sat on the couch, watching him work. "We have the video evidence," he was saying, "and I've spoken to 3 witnesses who are willing to give statements. The school's inaction makes them complicit. We'll need to address that as well." He ended the call and turned to Emily. "I've scheduled a meeting with the school board. You'll need to come with me to give your account." Emily's stomach clenched. "Do I have to?" James sat beside her, his expression softening. "You don't have to say much, but your voice is important. People need to hear what you went through." Emily hesitated, then nodded. "Okay, I'll do it." Word of the incident had spread quickly, and the community was rallying. Flyers were posted in coffee shops and libraries, calling for a town hall to address systemic issues at Maplewood High. Local news stations picked up the story, and the video of Emily's humiliation went viral on social media. At first, Emily felt exposed, as if the world was peering into her most vulnerable moment. But then the messages started pouring in words of encouragement from strangers who shared their own stories of injustice. One message stood out. It was from a woman named Clara, who introduced herself as a former student of Maplewood High. "I saw your story," Clara wrote. "What happened to you reminded me of what I went through when I was your age. I stayed silent, but seeing you stand up gives me hope. Thank you for being brave." Emily read the message twice, her chest tightening with a mix of emotions. She showed it to James, who smiled. "See," he said, "your courage is already making a difference." The night of the town hall, the gymnasium of the local community center was packed. Emily, James, and Ryan sat in the front row, surrounded by friends, neighbors, and concerned parents. A panel of speakers, including James, had been assembled to address the crowd. When it was James's turn to speak, he stood confidently at the podium, his voice carrying through the room. "What happened to my daughter was not an isolated incident," he began. "It's a symptom of a larger problem, a system that allows individuals in positions of power to act without accountability." The audience murmured in agreement. James continued, his tone unwavering. "But we're here tonight because we believe things can change. We believe that by standing together, we can demand better for our children, for our schools, and for our community." The room erupted into applause as James stepped down. Emily watched him, a flicker of pride igniting in her chest. After the event, attendees approached Emily to offer words of support. One elderly woman, her hair silver and her eyes kind, took Emily's hands in hers. "You're a strong young lady," she said. "What you're doing is important. Never let anyone dim your light." Emily's eyes filled with tears as she thanked the woman. For the first time since the incident, she felt a sense of purpose, a spark of hope that refused to be extinguished. As they drove home that night, Emily looked out the car window, the streetlights casting long shadows on the pavement. She turned to her father, her voice quiet but resolute. "Dad, I want to keep fighting. Not just for me, but for everyone who feels like their voice doesn't matter." James smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "Then we'll fight together." And for the first time in days, Emily allowed herself to believe that things could get better. The school board meeting was scheduled for the following Thursday evening. By the time Emily and her father arrived at the school's administrative building, the parking lot was filled with cars, and a small crowd had gathered near the entrance. Reporters stood with cameras and microphones, their voices blending with the hum of the gathering. James held Emily's hand as they walked inside. She was wearing a simple blue sweater and jeans, her hair now short but neatly styled. Despite her father's steady presence, her stomach twisted with anxiety. "It's okay to be nervous," James said softly, sensing her hesitation. "Just remember, you don't have to do this alone." Emily nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Inside the boardroom, the tension was palpable. Parents, students, and community members filled the seats, their expressions ranging from concern to anger. The school board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, their faces unreadable. Principal Grace Nolan was seated off to the side, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Emily glanced across the room and saw Officer Brad Turner. He sat stiffly, his arms crossed over his chest, his jaw set in defiance. Beside him sat his lawyer, a man with sharp features and a polished demeanor. As the meeting began, the board chairperson, a middle-aged woman with a stern expression, called the room to order. "We are here to address the recent incident involving Officer Turner and student Emily Dawson," she announced. "We will hear statements from both sides before making a determination." James stood first. His presence was commanding, his voice steady and clear as he laid out the facts. The incident in question was not just an abuse of authority. It was a violation of my daughter's dignity and rights, he said. This community entrusts its schools to protect and nurture its students. What happened to Emily was the opposite of that. He presented the video evidence, the footage playing on a large screen at the front of the room. The sound of scissors cutting through hair echoed eerily through the silent space. Gasps rippled through the audience as the events unfolded on the screen. When the video ended, James continued, "This is not an isolated incident. It's part of a larger issue of culture that allows individuals like Officer Turner to act with impunity. This board has a responsibility to ensure that our schools are safe for all students, not just some." He stepped back, his eyes briefly meeting Emily's. She felt a surge of gratitude for her father's unwavering support. Next, it was Emily's turn. Her hands trembled slightly as she stood, but she squared her shoulders and approached the podium. The room seemed to hold its breath as she began to speak. "My name is Emily Dawson," she said, her voice steady despite the weight of 100 eyes on her. "What happened to me was humiliating, but it was also a wake-up call. I always believed that schools were a place where we were supposed to feel safe, where we were supposed to be treated with respect. That wasn't what I experienced." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I didn't break any rules. I didn't hurt anyone. The only thing I did was exist as myself. And for that, I was targeted." Emily's gaze swept the room, landing on Turner. "What you did to me didn't just take away my hair. It made me question my worth. No one should have to feel that way, especially not in a place that's supposed to protect them." Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong, like they weren't enough. This has to change." The room erupted into applause as she stepped back, her cheeks flushed. She returned to her seat beside James, who gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. Turner's lawyer stood next. His defense was technical, focused on procedural justifications and attempts to downplay the severity of the incident. Officer Turner acted within the scope of his duties as a school resource officer, the lawyer argued. His intention was not to humiliate, but to address what he perceived as a disruption to the school environment. The audience murmured in disbelief, their skepticism evident. Finally, it was Turner's turn to speak. He stood, his posture rigid, and addressed the board. "I was enforcing discipline," he said, his voice clipped. "Sometimes tough decisions have to be made to maintain order." His words hung in the air, but the crowd's reaction made it clear that they weren't buying it. After hours of testimony and deliberation, the board reconvened to announce their decision. The chairperson's expression was grave as she spoke. "After reviewing the evidence and hearing the statements presented tonight, we find Officer Turner's actions to be unacceptable and in violation of the standards we expect from school staff. Effective immediately, Officer Turner's employment with Maplewood High is terminated. Furthermore, we will be implementing mandatory training for all staff on bias and proper conduct." The room erupted into cheers and applause. Emily felt a rush of relief, the weight of the past week lifting slightly from her shoulders. Turner's expression hardened, but he said nothing as he stood and left the room, his lawyer trailing behind him. As Emily and James stepped out into the cool night air, they were met with a crowd of supporters. Students, parents, and neighbors clapped and cheered, their voices a chorus of encouragement. Sarah ran up to Emily, pulling her into a hug. "You were amazing," she said, her eyes shining with pride. Emily smiled, the warmth of her community surrounding her like a shield. For the first time in days, she felt a sense of hope not just for herself, but for the change she knew they had sparked. As they walked to the car, Emily turned to her father. "Do you think it's really over?" James shook his head. "Not yet. This was just the first step, but it's a big one." Emily nodded, her resolve strengthening. She wasn't done fighting. Not yet. The morning after the school board's decision, the Dawson household was unusually calm. Emily sat on the couch in her pajamas, a warm cup of tea cradled in her hands. The sunlight streaming through the window felt brighter, softer, like a weight had lifted from the air. Her father entered the room, already dressed in a crisp shirt and tie, though his face carried the relaxed look of someone who had just cleared a major hurdle. "How are you feeling this morning?" he asked, sitting beside her. Emily shrugged, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Better. Relieved, I guess." James nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "That's normal. But remember, this isn't the end. There's still work to be done." She sighed, staring into her tea. "I know, but it feels good to know he's gone at least." Her voice trailed off. "What is it? I still feel like everyone's watching me. Like I'm the girl who caused all this. It's weird." James placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You didn't cause this, Emily. You stood up for yourself. People might be watching, but they're watching because you've inspired them. That's something to be proud of." At school, the atmosphere was different. Students greeted Emily with nods and smiles, and a few even stopped to thank her. "You did something brave," said Jessica Nguyen, a classmate Emily barely knew. "We all owe you for that." Emily nodded, her cheeks warming at the attention. She wasn't used to being in the spotlight, but it was clear that her actions had left an impression. In the cafeteria, she sat with Sarah, who was scrolling through her phone. "Have you seen this?" Sarah asked, turning the screen toward Emily. Emily leaned in to see a post on social media. It was a photo of her standing at the podium during the school board meeting, her words quoted in bold letters. "I'm not just speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who has ever been made to feel like they didn't belong." The caption below read, "A true leader." "Thank you, Emily Dawson." Emily's stomach fluttered as she read the comments' words of support and gratitude from strangers. "People are really paying attention," Sarah said, her grin wide. Emily nodded, though the realization was both comforting and overwhelming. She had never set out to become a symbol of change, but now that she was, she couldn't ignore the responsibility. Meanwhile, Officer Turner's world was unraveling. His dismissal had made headlines, and the video of his actions was being shared far and wide. Local news anchors debated the implications of his behavior, and legal experts weighed in on the possibility of civil and criminal charges. In his small apartment on the outskirts of town, Turner sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. His lawyer's voice echoed in his mind. "You crossed the line, Brad, and there's no easy way out of this." Turner had spent years enforcing discipline, believing that his authority gave him the right to act however he saw fit. But now, stripped of his badge and his job, he was forced to confront the reality of his choices. Back at school, Emily found herself drawn into conversations about change. Teachers and students alike began discussing the need for better training and accountability. Principal Nolan, who had remained quiet during much of the ordeal, announced a series of initiatives, including mandatory workshops on cultural sensitivity and bias. One afternoon, as Emily was packing up her things after class, her science teacher, Mr. Logan, stopped her. "Emily," he said, his tone gentle, "I just wanted to say how proud I am of you. What you did, what you're doing, it's making a difference." "Thank you," Emily said, her voice soft. Mr. Logan hesitated before continuing. "I know this isn't easy, but sometimes the hardest battles lead to the most important changes." Emily nodded, his words resonating deeply. That evening, James was in his home office, surrounded by legal briefs and case files. Emily knocked softly before stepping inside. "Hey, Dad," she said, sitting on the edge of his desk. James looked up from his work, his expression softening. "What's on your mind?" "I was thinking," she began, twisting her hands nervously. "What if we did something more? Like, what if we started a group or something? For students who feel like they don't have a voice." James leaned back in his chair, a proud smile spreading across his face. "That's a great idea, Emily. What do you have in mind?" "I don't know yet," she admitted. "Maybe a club at school, or a place where people can talk about stuff like this, so they don't feel alone." James nodded. "I think that's a wonderful idea, and I'll help you in any way I can." Emily smiled, her heart lifting. For the first time, she felt a sense of control over her narrative, a chance to turn her pain into something meaningful. The following week, Emily and Sarah worked together to draft a proposal for the club, which they called Voices of Change. They presented it to Principal Nolan, who, to their surprise, seemed genuinely supportive. "I think this could be a positive step for our school," Nolan said, her tone more earnest than Emily had ever heard. "Let's make it happen." Within days, the club was up and running. The first meeting was small, just Emily, Sarah, and a handful of other students, but it was enough to spark something bigger. As they sat in a circle, sharing their stories and ideas, Emily realized that her journey wasn't just about seeking justice for herself. It was about creating a space where others could find their voices too. At home that night, Emily sat on the porch, the cool evening air wrapping around her like a blanket. James joined her, carrying 2 mugs of hot cocoa. "You've had quite a week," he said, handing her a mug. Emily nodded, a contented smile on her face. "Yeah, but it feels good, like we're actually making a difference." James looked at her, his expression filled with pride. "You're doing more than that, Emily. You're showing people what it means to be brave, to stand up even when it's hard. That's something no one can take away from you." Emily leaned against him, the warmth of his presence steadying her. As the stars began to dot the night sky, she felt a quiet peace settle over her. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time, she felt ready to face it. And she knew, deep down, that the best was yet to come. The first official meeting of Voices of Change took place in the art room after school on a rainy Wednesday. The room smelled faintly of paint and clay, its walls adorned with vibrant student artwork. A dozen students sat in a semicircle, their faces a mix of curiosity and nervousness. Emily stood at the front, her hands clasped together. Though her heart pounded in her chest, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. When Sarah and I started this, we weren't sure how many people would come, but it means a lot to see all of you." Sarah, standing beside her, grinned and gave Emily an encouraging thumbs up. Emily continued, "This isn't just about what happened to me. It's about making sure everyone feels like they belong, like their voices matter. If you've ever felt overlooked, ignored, or disrespected, this is a space for you. A space where we can work together to create change." The group nodded, their expressions softening as Emily's words sank in. One by one, students began sharing their experiences. A boy named Ethan spoke about being mocked for his stutter. A girl named Mariana talked about the isolation she felt as one of the few students learning English as a second language. Emily listened intently, her chest tightening with both empathy and resolve. By the end of the meeting, the room buzzed with a sense of solidarity. As they cleaned up, Sarah nudged Emily. "You did great," she said. "This is just the beginning." Emily smiled, the weight of her earlier nervousness lifting. "I hope so." The next day, word about the club began to spread. More students signed up, and even a few teachers expressed interest in supporting it. Mr. Logan stopped Emily in the hallway. "I hear your club's off to a strong start," he said, his tone warm. "Yeah," Emily replied. "It feels good to do something positive." Mr. Logan nodded. "If you ever need help, let me know. What you're doing is important." For the first time in weeks, Emily felt a sense of pride, not just for standing up for herself, but for creating a space where others could do the same. Meanwhile, James was working tirelessly on the legal case against Officer Turner. The civil suit had gained traction, with more witnesses coming forward to share their accounts of Turner's behavior. During a late-night strategy session in his office, James received a call from a reporter. The journalist, a woman named Naomi Ford, had been following the case closely. "I wanted to write a piece on your daughter," Naomi said. "Not just about what happened to her, but about what she's doing now. It's inspiring." James hesitated, his protective instincts kicking in. "Emily's been through a lot. I don't want her to feel overwhelmed." Naomi's voice softened. "I understand, but sometimes stories like hers can create real change. It's up to you, of course." James thought about it for a moment before replying. "I'll talk to her and let you know." When James brought it up the next day, Emily was initially hesitant. "I don't know, Dad," she said. "What if people think I'm just doing this for attention?" James shook his head. "Anyone who knows you knows that's not true. This is an opportunity to show others that standing up for yourself can make a difference." Emily considered his words, then nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The article was published a week later. Titled "One Student's Fight for Justice Sparks a Movement," it detailed Emily's experience, the creation of voices of change, and the broader issues it represented. The response was overwhelming. Messages poured in from across the country, students, parents, and teachers sharing their stories of resilience and gratitude. One message in particular stood out to Emily. It was from a high school counselor in another state. "Dear Emily," it read, "I work with students who often feel unseen and unheard. Your story reminded me why I chose this job. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up." Emily read the message twice, her heart swelling. She showed it to Sarah, who grinned. "See? You're making a difference." At the next Voices of Change meeting, the group had nearly doubled in size. Students shared new ideas, from organizing workshops on inclusivity to starting a peer support network. One suggestion came from Mariana, who had barely spoken at the first meeting. "What if we hold a kindness day?" she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Kindness day?" Emily asked. "Yeah," Mariana said, her cheeks flushing. "We could do small things to make people feel good, like notes of encouragement or helping out students who need it, just to remind everyone that kindness matters." The group murmured in agreement, their enthusiasm growing. "That's a great idea," Emily said, smiling at Mariana. Over the next week, the club worked tirelessly to organize the event. They decorated the hallways with posters and set up a table in the cafeteria where students could write anonymous notes of encouragement. The day was a resounding success. Students who had never spoken to each other exchanged smiles and kind words. Teachers commented on the positive shift in the school's atmosphere. Emily watched it all unfold, her heart swelling with pride. During lunch, a quiet boy named Liam approached her. He handed her a folded note and walked away before she could say anything. Curious, Emily opened the note. "Thank you for making this school a better place," it read. Tears pricked her eyes as she folded the note carefully and slipped it into her pocket. That evening, Emily sat with her father on the porch. The warm glow of the streetlights bathed the quiet neighborhood. "You did something amazing today," James said, his voice full of pride. Emily smiled, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "I couldn't have done it without everyone else." James nodded. "That's the beauty of it. Change isn't something you do alone. It's something you build together." Emily leaned back, letting his words settle in her heart. The challenges she had faced hadn't defined her, they had shaped her into someone stronger, someone who could inspire others to stand up and speak out. And as she sat there, surrounded by the quiet strength of her family and community, she realized that this was just the beginning. The success of Voices of Change spread like wildfire through Maplewood High. What had started as a small group of students meeting in the art room had become a movement that touched every corner of the school. Kindness Day had set the tone for something deeper, a collective understanding that even small acts could create big change. Emily arrived at school on Monday to find a sticky note on her locker. In neat, blocky handwriting, it read, "Thank you for showing us how to be brave." She smiled as she tucked the note into her bag, her heart warm. Walking to class, she noticed more signs of change. Students who had barely interacted before were chatting in the hallways. A group of boys helped a teacher carry supplies to her classroom. And on the cafeteria walls, the notes of encouragement from Kindness Day were still displayed, creating a vibrant mosaic of positivity. The growing unity within the school didn't go unnoticed. Local news outlets picked up the story, and a journalist even came to one of the Voices of Change meetings to interview the group. "Emily," the journalist asked during the meeting, "did you ever imagine your experience would lead to something like this?" Emily hesitated, her cheeks flushing. "No," she admitted. "At first, I just wanted to get through it. But seeing how many people care and want to make things better, that's what keeps me going." The journalist smiled. "And what do you hope comes next?" Emily glanced around the room at her peers. "I hope we keep building, that we make sure no one ever feels like they're alone or powerless again." Meanwhile, James continued to work tirelessly on the civil case against Officer Turner. The discovery process was underway, and the evidence piling up against Turner painted a clear picture of systemic issues. "This isn't just about Emily anymore," James told his legal team during a late-night meeting. "This case has the potential to set a precedent. If we win, it could change the way schools and resource officers handle situations like this nationwide." The legal battle was gaining national attention, with advocacy groups and civil rights organizations rallying behind the Dawsons. Offers of support poured in, lawyers volunteering their time, activists organizing fundraisers, and even donations from strangers moved by Emily's story. One evening, as Emily sat at the dining table finishing her homework, James came in with a folder of papers. "Can we talk?" he asked, sitting across from her. "Sure," Emily said, setting her pencil down. James opened the folder and showed her a letter. "This is from the state attorney's office. They're officially filing criminal charges against Turner for abuse of power and misconduct." Emily's eyes widened. "Does that mean he could go to jail?" James nodded. "It's possible. But more importantly, it means the system is holding him accountable. That's a big step." Emily sat back, processing the news. She had imagined this moment before, but now that it was real, it felt heavier than she expected. "Are you okay?" James asked gently. "I think so," Emily said slowly. "It's just, I never thought it would go this far. It's a lot to take in." James reached across the table, resting his hand on hers. "You've been through so much, and you've handled it with more strength than most adults could. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together." Emily nodded, comforted by his steady presence. At the next Voices of Change meeting, the group discussed how to address issues beyond their school. Mariana suggested partnering with other high schools to organize a district-wide event, while Ethan proposed creating a social media campaign to share their stories. "I think we should focus on things we can keep doing here, too," Emily added, "like maybe starting a mentorship program for younger students." The group agreed, their enthusiasm palpable. By the end of the meeting, they had a list of initiatives to pursue, each one designed to amplify their impact. Amidst the flurry of activity, Emily experienced an unexpected moment of kindness that stayed with her. One afternoon, she was walking home from school when it started to rain. She hadn't brought an umbrella, and by the time she reached the corner near her house, she was soaked. "Emily," a voice called out. She turned to see Mrs. Harper, the elderly woman who lived a few houses down. She stood on her porch, holding a large umbrella. "Come here, dear," Mrs. Harper said, beckoning her over. Emily hesitated, then jogged up the steps. "Look at you," Mrs. Harper said, shaking her head. "Come inside and dry off. You'll catch a cold out here." Inside, the house smelled of freshly baked cookies. Mrs. Harper handed Emily a towel and a warm mug of tea. "You've been through a lot lately," Mrs. Harper said as they sat in the cozy living room. "But you're handling it with such grace. I'm proud of you, you know." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat. "Thank you," she said softly. Mrs. Harper smiled. "Kindness matters, Emily. It's not always big gestures. Sometimes it's just showing up for each other, like you've been doing for your school." The words stayed with Emily as she walked the rest of the way home. That night, as she sat with James on the porch, she recounted the encounter. "Mrs. Harper was so sweet," Emily said, staring out at the stars. "It reminded me how much kindness can mean, even when it's something small." James smiled. "It's those moments that make the bigger battles worth fighting. They remind us why we do what we do." Emily nodded, the warmth of Mrs. Harper's words still lingering in her heart. The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, media interviews, and legal updates. Through it all, Emily's confidence grew. She was no longer just the girl at the center of a controversy. She was a leader, a voice for change, and a beacon of hope for others who had felt powerless. As the trial date approached, Emily knew the road ahead would be challenging. But with her family, her friends, and her community behind her, she felt ready to face whatever came next. Because she had learned something important. Resilience wasn't just about surviving. It was about growing, building, and lifting others along the way. The day of the trial arrived with a chill in the air. Emily woke early, the weight of the day pressing down on her chest. She stared at the ceiling, her thoughts racing. Though James had assured her that she didn't have to testify, she knew the trial's outcome would rest on the strength of her story. Downstairs, James was already dressed, his suit crisp and his expression serious. He looked up from a stack of legal documents when Emily entered the kitchen. "Morning," he said softly, pouring her a cup of tea. "Morning," Emily replied, her voice tinged with nerves. She took the tea gratefully, holding the warm mug in her hands. "You ready for this?" James asked, sitting across from her. Emily nodded slowly. "I think so. I don't want to mess anything up." "You won't," James said firmly. "The truth is on our side, Emily. And no matter what happens in that courtroom, you've already made a difference." His words steadied her, and she managed a small smile. The courtroom was packed. Reporters sat along the back wall, their pens poised over notepads. Community members filled the seats, many of them there to support Emily. She spotted Sarah and Mariana sitting together near the front, their encouraging smiles a source of comfort. Officer Brad Turner sat at the defense table, his jaw tight and his expression impassive. His lawyer leaned over to whisper something to him, but he barely reacted. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. Emily's heart pounded as the trial began. James started his opening statement with the same calm authority he brought to every case. "This trial is about accountability," he began. "It's about ensuring that those in positions of power are held to the same standards as the rest of us." He outlined the evidence, from the video footage to the testimonies of witnesses who had seen Turner's behavior over the years. "What happened to my daughter wasn't an isolated incident," James concluded. "It was part of a pattern, one that we must address if we are to uphold the principles of justice and fairness." Over the next few days, the prosecution presented its case. Witnesses described how Turner had targeted students, often those who were most vulnerable. One former student, a young man named Caleb, shared a story of being publicly berated by Turner for wearing a hoodie in the hallway. "He always made me feel like I didn't belong," Caleb said, his voice shaking. "Like I was a problem, just for existing." The defense tried to argue that Turner's actions were necessary for maintaining order, but the evidence was damning. When it was Emily's turn to testify, she took a deep breath and walked to the stand. James had prepared her for this moment, but the weight of the room still pressed heavily on her shoulders. As she recounted the incident, her voice was steady but filled with emotion. "I wasn't breaking any rules," she said. "I was just walking to class. But he made me feel like I had done something wrong just by being myself." She described the humiliation, the fear, and the lingering impact it had on her. "It wasn't just about my hair," she said, her voice cracking slightly. "It was about my dignity, and no one should have the power to take that away from someone else." James watched her with pride as she stepped down from the stand, her testimony leaving an indelible mark on everyone in the room. During a break in the proceedings, Emily stepped outside to catch her breath. The crisp autumn air filled her lungs, grounding her in the moment. "Emily," a voice called. She turned to see Mrs. Harper, her elderly neighbor, standing with a small group of supporters. "I wanted to tell you how proud I am," Mrs. Harper said, taking Emily's hands in hers. "What you're doing here, it's brave, and it's important." "Thank you," Emily said, her eyes welling with tears. Another supporter, a man in his 30s, stepped forward. "My little sister went through something similar in another school district," he said. "Seeing you stand up gives us hope that things can change." Emily nodded, her resolve strengthening. These people believed in her, and that belief gave her the courage to keep fighting. Back in the courtroom, the defense called Turner to the stand. His testimony was cold and defensive, full of justifications and deflections. I was just doing my job, he said repeatedly. Discipline is necessary in a school environment. But under cross-examination, James dismantled Turner's argument piece by piece. Do you believe discipline includes public humiliation? James asked, his tone calm but cutting. Turner hesitated. I didn't intend to humiliate her. But you did, James pressed. And the evidence shows this wasn't the first time. So, I'll ask again. Do you believe public humiliation is an appropriate form of discipline? Turner's silence spoke louder than words. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. James's closing argument was powerful, a culmination of his years of experience and his personal investment in the case. What happened to Emily wasn't just a violation of her rights, he said, his voice resonating through the room. It was a reminder that when we allow power to go unchecked, we all suffer. But we have the opportunity to send a message today that no one is above accountability, and that justice applies to everyone. The jury deliberated for hours, each minute stretching endlessly for Emily. She sat with her father, her hands clasped tightly together, her mind racing with possibilities. Finally, the jury returned. The courtroom fell silent as the forepersons stood to read the verdict. In the case of Emily Dawson versus Officer Brad Turner, we find the defendant guilty of abuse of power and misconduct. The words echoed in Emily's ears, a wave of relief washing over her. Tears streamed down her face as James pulled her into a tight embrace. It's over, he whispered. The judge issued Turner's sentence, a combination of community service, mandatory training, and a permanent mark on his record that would bar him from future law enforcement roles. While the punishment didn't erase what had happened, it was a step toward accountability, and for Emily, that was enough. That evening, Emily and James returned home to find their porch decorated with flowers and notes from neighbors and friends. Ryan ran out to greet them, his face beaming with pride. You did it, he exclaimed, hugging Emily tightly. Emily smiled through her tears. We did it. As they sat together that night, surrounded by the quiet comfort of home, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The fight wasn't over, there was still work to be done, but for the first time, she felt truly free. And she knew, deep in her heart, that the courage it had taken to stand up would carry her forward, no matter what challenges lay ahead. The days following the trial were a blur of emotions for Emily. Relief mingled with exhaustion, and the overwhelming outpouring of support from her community filled her heart. Yet, a quiet unease lingered. She knew this wasn't the end of her journey. At school, students greeted her with smiles and high fives. Notes of encouragement still adorned the hallways, some bearing simple messages like, "You're amazing, Emily," while others shared deeper gratitude. Teachers stopped her between classes to offer words of support, and Principal Nolan, now more visible and engaged, began personally meeting with voices of change to discuss improvements to school policies. Emily sat in the club meeting one Wednesday afternoon, surrounded by the growing group of students. They were brainstorming ideas for their next project when Mariana spoke up. What if we host a district-wide assembly? She suggested, her voice gaining strength as she continued. We could share our stories and invite other schools to join the movement. That's ambitious, Sarah said, grinning. But I love it. The group erupted into chatter, their enthusiasm filling the room. Emily smiled as she listened. This is what it was all for, she thought. Later that evening, Emily joined her father on the porch, their shared sanctuary after long days. The cool autumn breeze carried the scent of leaves and distant chimneys, a reminder of the changing season. You seem deep in thought, James observed, handing her a cup of cocoa. Emily leaned back in her chair, her eyes on the horizon. I was just thinking about everything that's happened. It's hard to believe it's only been a few months since you know. James nodded. A lot has changed, but you've handled it with grace and strength. I'm not sure I feel strong, Emily admitted. There are still days when I think about everything Turner did, and it makes me feel small. James reached over, his hand resting on hers. Strength isn't about never feeling small. It's about standing up anyway. You've done that, and you've inspired others to do the same. Emily smiled, the warmth of his words settling in her heart. As the week unfolded, plans for the district-wide assembly began to take shape. With the support of Principal Nolan and Mr. Logan, Voices of Change reached out to neighboring schools, inviting students and educators to participate. To Emily's surprise, the response was overwhelmingly positive. Schools that had faced similar issues were eager to collaborate, and the assembly quickly grew into a full-scale event. Emily found herself busier than ever, balancing schoolwork, club meetings, and planning sessions. Despite the long hours, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. One afternoon, as Emily was leaving the library, she noticed a group of younger students sitting on the steps. They looked up as she passed, their whispers barely audible. "Hey," Emily said, stopping. "Everything okay?" A boy with glasses nodded shyly. "We just wanted to say thanks." "For what?" Emily asked, kneeling slightly to meet their gaze. "For making the school better," another boy said, his voice quiet but sincere. Emily's heart swelled. "That means a lot," she said. "But you know what? You're part of this too. Change doesn't just happen because of one person. It's all of us working together." The boys nodded, their faces lighting up. As Emily walked away, she couldn't stop smiling. The day of the assembly arrived, and the gymnasium at Maplewood High buzzed with excitement. Rows of chairs filled quickly as students, teachers, and community members from across the district gathered. A large banner reading "Voices of Change, Together for a Better Tomorrow" hung above the stage. Emily stood backstage with Sarah and Mariana, her nerves fluttering. "You've got this," Sarah said, squeezing her hand. Mariana nodded. "You've done harder things. This is just telling your story." Emily took a deep breath. "You're right. Let's do this." As the event began, Principal Nolan welcomed the crowd, her voice steady as she acknowledged the challenges the district had faced and the steps being taken to address them. Then it was Emily's turn. Stepping onto the stage, she felt the weight of hundreds of eyes on her. But as she looked out into the crowd, she saw familiar faces: her father, Ryan, Mrs. Harper, and the younger students who had thanked her on the library steps. Their presence grounded her. "Good morning," she began, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "My name is Emily Dawson, and I want to thank you all for being here today." She paused, her gaze sweeping the room. "When I started this journey, I didn't think I'd be standing here. What happened to me was one of the hardest things I've ever faced. But it also taught me something important, that our voices matter." She shared her story, not with bitterness, but with hope, weaving in the stories of others she had met along the way. "This isn't just about what happened to me," she said. "It's about what we can do together to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else." The audience erupted into applause as she stepped back, her chest swelling with pride. After the event, students and teachers approached her, their words of encouragement and gratitude echoing in her ears. One girl, no older than 13, hugged Emily tightly. "You're my hero," the girl whispered. Tears pricked Emily's eyes as she hugged the girl back. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. That evening, Emily and James sat together, reflecting on the day's events. "You've done something incredible," James said, his tone filled with pride. "I couldn't have done it without you," Emily replied. James smiled. "It's all you, kiddo. And this is just the beginning." As the stars dotted the night sky, Emily felt a sense of peace and purpose she hadn't known before. The trial might have ended, but her journey was far from over. Because the real change, the kind that lasts, was just beginning to take root. The weeks following the assembly at Maplewood High brought a wave of change Emily could never have anticipated. What had started as a local movement began to ripple outward. Articles about the assembly were shared widely online, and Voices of Change received invitations from other schools to speak about their mission. Emily found herself busier than ever, juggling school, club activities, and a growing number of public speaking opportunities. It was overwhelming at times, but it was also deeply rewarding. Each time she shared her story, she felt stronger, more confident, and more connected to the people around her. One chilly November morning, as she was sorting through emails with Sarah, she noticed one that stood out. "Look at this," Emily said, her eyes widening. Sarah leaned over to read the subject line: "Invitation to speak at the State Education Summit." "Oh my gosh, Emily," Sarah said, grabbing her arm. "This is huge." Emily's heart raced as she opened the email. It was from the State Board of Education, inviting her to be a keynote speaker at an upcoming summit focused on equity in schools. "They want me to speak," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course they do," Sarah exclaimed. "You've been amazing. This is just the next step?" Emily wasn't so sure. The idea of speaking in front of hundreds of educators and policymakers made her stomach churn. That evening, she sat on the porch with her father, the email open on her phone. "I don't know if I can do this," she admitted, her voice trembling. "It's one thing to talk at school or in front of friends, but this feels too big." James leaned back in his chair, studying her. "Do you remember what you told me after the trial?" he asked. Emily frowned. "What do you mean?" "You said you wanted to keep fighting, that you wanted to use your voice to help others." "I know," she said, sighing. "But this is different." James shook his head. "It's the same. The people at that summit need to hear what you have to say. You've already inspired so many people, Emily. This is just another opportunity to do that." Emily looked down at her hands, James's words settling over her. "I'll think about it," she said finally. Over the next few days, she couldn't stop thinking about the invitation. She talked it over with Sarah and Mariana during their next Voices of Change meeting, and their excitement was contagious. "You have to do it," Mariana said, her eyes shining. "Think about all the people you'll inspire." Sarah nodded. "And we'll help you prepare. You're not in this alone." Emily smiled, their encouragement warming her heart. By the end of the meeting, she had made her decision. The weeks leading up to the summit were a whirlwind of preparation. Emily worked tirelessly with her father, her friends, and even Mr. Logan, who helped her craft her speech. "You don't have to be perfect," Mr. Logan said during one practice session. "Just be yourself. That's what people connect with." As the day of the summit approached, Emily's nerves grew, but so did her determination. The summit was held in a grand conference center in the city. The towering glass building and the buzz of activity inside made Emily's heart race as she entered with James. The main hall was filled with educators, administrators, and policymakers, all chatting as they found their seats. Emily peeked out from backstage, the sheer size of the crowd making her stomach flip. "You're going to do great," James said, squeezing her shoulder. Emily took a deep breath. "I hope so." When her name was announced, the room fell silent. She stepped onto the stage, the bright lights momentarily blinding her. As she reached the podium, her hands trembled slightly, but she steadied herself. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear despite the pounding of her heart. "My name is Emily Dawson, and I'm here today because I believe in the power of voices, yours, mine, and the voices of every student in our schools." She shared her story, weaving in the lessons she had learned along the way. She spoke about the importance of kindness, the strength of community, and the need for accountability. "This isn't just about one school or one incident," she said, her voice growing stronger. "It's about creating an environment where every student feels safe, valued, and seen. And that starts with all of us." The room erupted into applause as she stepped back, her heart soaring. Afterward, people lined up to speak with her. Educators thanked her for her courage, while students shared their own stories of struggle and resilience. One teacher, a woman in her 40s, took Emily's hands. "You reminded me why I became a teacher," she said, tears in her eyes. "Thank you." Emily felt a lump rise in her throat as she nodded. "Thank you for listening." As she and James drove home that evening, Emily stared out the window, the city lights twinkling against the dark sky. "You were incredible," James said, glancing at her. Emily smiled. "It felt good. Scary, but good." "That's how you know it's worth doing," James said. She nodded, the truth of his words settling in her chest. Back at school, the impact of Emily's speech was immediate. Teachers began implementing ideas inspired by her story, and more students joined Voices of Change. During a meeting, Sarah announced that they had received another invitation, this time to work with a statewide student advisory board on equity in education. "We're really doing this," Emily said, her voice filled with wonder. "We are," Sarah replied, grinning. Emily looked around the room, her heart swelling with pride. The work was far from over, but for the first time, she felt ready to face whatever came next. because she had learned that even the smallest voice could create a ripple, and when those ripples joined together, they could change the world. Winter settled over Maplewood, blanketing the town in crisp air and frosty mornings. At school, students bundled in coats and scarves made their way through hallways that seemed warmer, now not just from the heat, but from the sense of community that had blossomed in recent months. Emily stood in the art room, where Voices of Change was holding its last meeting of the semester. The club had grown so much that it now needed 2 classrooms to accommodate everyone. As students filed in, chatting and laughing, Emily glanced at Sarah and Mariana, who were busy arranging papers and notes for the day's agenda. "Ready?" Sarah asked, giving Emily a playful nudge. Emily smiled, her nerves replaced by a quiet confidence. "Always." The meeting began with updates from different committees. Ethan reported on the mentorship program, which had paired high school students with middle schoolers to provide guidance and support. Mariana shared progress on the district-wide equity initiative they had started with other schools. Finally, Emily stood to address the group. "I just want to say how proud I am of all of you," she began, her voice steady but warm. "What we've built here, it's more than I ever imagined. You've shown that change is possible when we work together, and that's something we should all be proud of." The room erupted into applause, and for a moment, Emily simply stood there, taking it all in. This wasn't just a club anymore, it was a movement, and it was theirs. The months after the trial had been a whirlwind of growth and opportunity for Emily. She had spoken at events, collaborated with students and teachers across the state, and even met with policymakers to discuss improvements to school systems. But amidst the accolades and invitations, she found herself craving moments of quiet reflection. One snowy evening, she and James sat together in the living room, the glow of the fireplace casting soft light across the room. "You've been busy," James said, sipping his tea. Emily nodded, her gaze fixed on the flickering flames. "It's been a lot, but it's worth it." James leaned forward, setting his mug on the table. "You've done more in the past few months than most people do in years. I hope you're taking time to appreciate that." "I am," Emily said, a small smile tugging at her lips. "But there's still so much to do." "There always will be," James said. "But it's okay to pause, to celebrate how far you've come." Emily thought about his words as they sat in companionable silence. The next day, Emily returned to school to find a surprise waiting for her. The students from Voices of Change had decorated her locker with streamers and notes of gratitude. One read, "Thank you for helping us find our voices." Another said, "You showed us what courage looks like." Emily felt tears prick her eyes as she read the messages. Sarah appeared beside her, grinning. "You deserve it," she said. "I don't know what to say," Emily said, her voice thick with emotion. "Just keep being you," Sarah replied. As the semester drew to a close, Principal Nolan invited Emily and James to a meeting to discuss the school's ongoing improvements. "We've implemented several new policies," Nolan said, sliding a folder across the table. "But we're also looking into long-term programs to ensure equity and accountability remain priorities." Emily flipped through the folder, impressed by the scope of the changes. "This is great," she said. "It's a step in the right direction." James nodded. "Sustaining these efforts will be key. You have our support." Nolan smiled. "Thank you, both of you. What you've done here has made all the difference." On the last day of school before winter break, the gymnasium was filled with students and teachers for a special assembly. Principal Nolan stood at the podium, addressing the crowd. "This semester has been one of growth and reflection for our school," she said. "And it's thanks to the courage and leadership of students like Emily Dawson." The room erupted into applause as Emily was called to the stage. She walked up, her heart pounding but her steps steady. Standing at the podium, she looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, some new. "Thank you," she began, her voice clear. "This has been a journey I never expected to take, but it's one I'm grateful for. What we've accomplished together is proof that change is possible, and it's only the beginning." The applause that followed was deafening, but what stayed with Emily was the sense of unity she felt in that moment. That evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, Emily and her family sat together in the living room. Ryan was sprawled on the floor, playing with their dog, while James read through a stack of papers. Emily sat by the window, watching the snowflakes drift down. She thought about everything that had happened: the trial, the assembly, the growth of voices of change. It had been hard, but it had also been worth it. Her phone buzzed with a message from Mariana. "Just wanted to say thank you for everything. You've changed so much more than just the school." Emily smiled, her heart swelling. She knew the work wasn't over, but for the first time, she felt at peace with the road ahead. James looked up, catching her expression. "What's on your mind?" Emily turned to him, her eyes bright. "Just thinking about how far we've come." He smiled. "And how far you'll go." She nodded, her chest filling with a quiet resolve. Because she knew now that every challenge, every act of kindness, and every voice added to the chorus could create something extraordinary. And she was ready to keep building that future, one step at a time. Emily's story reminds us that even in the face of injustice, resilience, kindness, and hope can create a path toward change. It is not about fighting alone, but about building a community where every voice matters and every story has the power to inspire. If you've been moved by Emily's journey, let it be a reminder that change starts with each of us by speaking up, standing together, and believing in the possibility of a better tomorrow. We hope Emily's story has left you inspired to make a difference in your own community. Don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Change for more stories that challenge, uplift, and remind us of the power we all have to create a brighter future. Hit the subscribe button, share this story with someone who needs to hear it, and join us on this journey of resilience and hope. Thank you for being a part of the Tales of Change family. And remember, together, we can make a difference. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.